Our next speaker is a true pioneer of modern psychedelic research, having conducted the first government-approved human study of MDMA in the early 90s. He laid part of the groundwork for the modern study of ayahuasca, as well as completing the first approved research study in several decades on the safety and efficacy of psilocybin-assisted therapy for anxiety in terminal cancer patients. Together with Alicia Danforth, he recently completed a pilot study on MDMA-assisted therapy for social anxiety in autistic adults. Let me introduce the director of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Harbor UCLA Medical Center and professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at the UCLA School of Medicine, Dr. Charles Grob.
Well, thank you, Philip. And it's really a pleasure to be here today to talk with you about what I've always considered to be a fascinating topic. This is actually my third trip to Stockholm. I was here last year when Philip and his colleagues invited me to speak at the Karolinska Institute. And I was here in 1966 when I was living with my family in Denmark. So it's good to return, and I've always really appreciated being in Sweden. I should also mention, as I mentioned last year, that I would not be here at all if not for Sweden, because in late 1939, after the Second World War had started, it was Sweden that opened up its borders to my mother, who was a refugee from Germany, which had closed its borders. And if not for Sweden allowing my mother and her family to come here, someone else would be standing here today speaking with you. So I will talk with you about just a variety of issues in psychedelics that I think have import. I've been interested in this topic since I was a very young man. I came of age in the 60s, went to college in the late 60s, and could not help but be influenced by the wave of interest in psychedelics at that time. However, I quickly realized that taking psychedelics in a college dormitory was less than ideal in regards to set and setting, and I forego their use for some years. But in the early 70s, I had an opportunity to explore the voluminous literature in psychiatric, medical, neuroscience, publications from the 50s and 60s, and was just really blown away by the enormity of the potential this model held. So at that point in time, I had actually dropped out of college. I was of great concern to my father, who felt I lacked direction. And I said to him one day, "Dad, I think I figured out what I want to do with my life." He said, "What's that, son?" I said, "I want to study psychedelics. They're fascinating. There's so much we could do, learn about the brain, you learn about mental illness, and these extraordinary treatment models that are helping people that normally don't get help very much." And my father, who was a very wise man, who was also a physician, he said, "Well, son, there might be something to what you say, but no one will listen to you unless you get your credentials." And I realized at that point I had to go back to school. So he gave me some very good advice. I don't think he anticipated I would persist with my interests, but I did. But I found to my chagrin that in medical school, not only was there no active use of psychedelics, the topic was virtually taboo. I gave a talk in my medical school about some work of Stanislav Grof's that I felt had great import, and my professors and classmates really wanted to have nothing to do with this topic, no discussion whatsoever. So I kept my interest to myself for years, progressed through my psychiatric training, my child psychiatric training, eventually made my way. I actually started at Johns Hopkins, moved out to California. And I should say to Matt Johnson, who gave a marvelous talk, but Matt, meaningful experiences do happen in Baltimore. I was born there, my most meaningful experience. So we'll treat Baltimore with a little more respect. But and in California, I made the acquaintance of Dave Nichols, who had this vision of starting the Hefter Research Institute. And in the early 90s, when he was ready to put it all together. He invited me to be a founding member of the board, and that's been a wonderful process working with like-minded physicians and scientists who felt a passion for this topic and felt it really needed to come up into the light of day again and be treated judiciously in open, sanctioned studies. And I think the Hefter and some companion organizations have been quite successful in moving the field forward over the last 25 years. So I could continue to digress, but I will move ahead. Let's see if I can make this work. Yeah, from adolescence to senescence, hallucinogens across the lifespan. You know, I've done a fair amount of psychedelic research. I'm also a full-time academician, administrator, teacher, and you know, of psychiatry and child psychiatry. And so I kind of see the impact at all ages, and I've had some thoughts and some experiences that I think might be relevant to some of you. So here's just a list of some of the funders who've helped me with my research over the years. This is an overview of the various topics I will touch upon during this brief talk. I feel it's very important to kind of understand cultural context. So that's part of what I want to address. But really starting with the issue of nomenclature. What do we call these remarkable compounds? And there's been a fair amount of debate over the years. Psychedelic was coined through an exchange between the great British writer Aldous Huxley and the British-Canadian psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond, who did some of the groundbreaking research with treating alcoholics in the 50s. So during the 1950s, Huxley and Osmond went back and forth. What do we call these compounds? And Huxley wrote to Osmond with a suggestion. He said, to make this trivial world sublime, take half a gram of phanerothym. He was suggesting phanerothym. Osmond quickly responded, to fathom hell or soar angelic, take a pinch of psychedelic. So that's how we came across psychedelic, which translates out roughly from the Greek as mind manifesting. Alternative terms have been entheogen, which is accessing the divine within. The great theologian Euston Smith, along with Gordon Wasson and Jonathan Ott, been influential in putting that term forward. And yet, not all of these compounds, under all circumstances, induce that accessing the divine within. Hallucinogen, I feel, needs to be rehabilitated. It's been an uncomfortable term for many because it's thought to convey pathologic states. But my great friend and teacher, Ralph Metzner, reminded me that hallucinogen stems, or the root of hallucinogens, from the Latin hallucinare, which translates out as mind wandering, mind journeying, tripping, as it were. And I've always felt that that has relevance to this discussion. And then a variety of other, whoops, go ahead. Yeah, just a variety of other terms. My favorite is fantasticant from Louis Lewin, the great father of modern psychopharmacology in the 1890s and early 2000s. And you can see many of these other are pathologizing terms. But psychedelic, associated with the 60s, a prevailing term today. Hallucinogen, though, has its place, particularly, I believe, within a medical research context. The classic hallucinogens share chemical structural similarity with the neurotransmitter serotonin. You can see psilocybin, DMT, LSD, the classic psychedelics or classic hallucinogens. And they were, many people don't realize the degree to which these compounds were quite influential in helping us establish much of what we know about neurobiology. Even going back to the 50s and early 60s, Daniel X. Freeman at the University of Chicago really first mapped out the serotonergic system through using radioisotope labeled LSD injected into laboratory animals and taking images of their brains. So we may not have had the serotonergic system without first having the hallucinogen LSD to work with. These are 5-HT2A receptor agonists. They're blocked by the 5-HT2A antagonist cantancerin. And we know also with repeated administration, there's rapid developments of of tolerance and downregulation. So the non-classic hallucinogens include ibogaine. I believe there are several topics, several talks today that I'm going to look forward to listening to. Ibogaine used in ritual or iboga, from which it's derived in Africa. It's used as an addiction interrupter, but yet it may have some cardiotoxic potential, which obviously needs to be further explored. Ketamine, very much in vogue currently. It's being used in treatment in the U.S. quite widely now. It's not a Schedule I drug, which marks it apart from other hallucinogens. Ketamine, though, is a dissociative hallucinogen. It doesn't. Its treatment does not involve psychotherapy. It's touted as a new revolutionary treatment for depression. However, the concern there is that treatment is short-lived. It only lasts, it would appear, for a couple of weeks, and then the physicians administering it recommend booster treatments with ketamine, which are both costly, and also we don't know the long-term health impact of ketamine. What's long-term repetitive use of ketamine going? How is it going to impact cognition over the long term, or or even mood regulation? We're not sure. I'd be very interested to look at a head-to-head trial with depressives using a ketamine model with a randomized group and a psilocybin model with a randomized group. I was looking at Matt's data that we have also. The psilocybin effect on mood is sustained for a far greater period of time than that which we see ketamine. Salvinorm A, used by the Mazatec, a secret plant medicine, even more so than mushrooms, it would appear. They introduced Gordon Wasson to psilocybe cubensis mushroom, but kept the use of salvia secret. It's used in ritual context among the indigenous people of Central Mexico. However, when it came to the U.S., its active diterpene, Salvinorm A, was isolated, and much of the use in the U.S. is this very potent, kind of knock your socks off Salvinorm A, potentized salvia experience, whereas with the indigenous people who don't smoke it, who don't isolate the diterpene and add it to the salvia, it's a matter of allowing many leaves to absorb very gradually through the buccal mucosa in the mouth, facilitating a gradual onset, sustained plateau state, which is the indigenous people are able to work with, able to do their healing work, their divination work, a very different model and a far safer model. So an example of perhaps how much we have to learn from the indigenous use of these compounds, and keeping in mind the indigenous people's use go back millennia, whereas we are very, very new to this game. So I think it behooves us not to be so superior and look down and disparaging and be dismissive of indigenous models, but to garner from them what can be learned and what can help us optimize our treatments and particularly optimizing safety parameters. Then we have MDMA. I don't have to say much about that. Very impressive preliminary work done in South Carolina on its treatment of chronic PTSD. And NBOM, a new hallucinogen only around in the last 10 years or so, active on microgram levels through sublingual absorption, and has been substituted for LSD and blotter, which can be very dangerous because this compound has been noted to induce hypertension and hyperpyrexia, agitation, problematic psychiatric responses, and there have been deaths associated. So NBOM is a very worrisome compound. So just a mention of that. So the range of effects, these are sustained alterations of consciousness. I think you're all aware of the definition of these states of psychedelic consciousness, alterations of perception, mood, and cognition with the preservation of a clear sensorium and orientation. These are visionary experiences. When I did my ayahuasca study in Brazil, the people I studied took offense to the hallucinogen rating scale, which we were administering, because I said, that infers a pathologic state. These are visionary states. So we changed the name of our measure, Rick Strassman's measure, to it translates out as a visionary rating scale. So it's, these are states are similar to dreams, spontaneous epiphanies, and psychotic states usually, but with preservation of orientation, memory, and ego identity, and then the critical importance of set and setting, which we can learn from indigenous people, and we can also learn from some of the pioneer psychedelic researchers in the early 60s, including Leary, Alpert, and my good friend Ralph Metzner. So some of the plant hallucinogens we're quite familiar with, psilocybe cubensis, mushrooms that have very, very potent visionary psychedelic effects, Lophophorus williamsi, isolated in the late 1890s by Louis Lewin and his colleague Arthur Hefter, after whom Dave had the inspiration to name the Hefter Research Institute. They isolated mescaline from Lophophorus williamsi. And then Claviceps purpura, a ergot fungus growing on rye, which is suspected to be the fabled kikikion, the psychoactive sacrament used in the ancient rites of Eleusis in ancient Greece. So these compounds go way back in time. Then ayahuasca, which I spent a fair amount of time in Brazil studying with my colleagues Dennis McKenna, Jace Callaway, and my Brazilian colleagues, particularly Glaucus de Souza Brito, and later Dartu Silveira, and my American associate anthropologist, Marlene de Rios. Psychotria viridis containing DMT, Banisteriopsis caapi, Harmala alkaloids, neither psychoactive when ingested alone. However, when brewed together, it has an extraordinary synergistic effect, eventuating in ayahuasca. Again, which has quite remarkable properties. So I like to say if I had to do it over again, I think I'd be an anthropology major. I just find the study of ancient peoples, indigenous peoples, quite fascinating, particularly when it comes to their use of these powerful psychoactive plants. Just a few of my favorite anthropologists, writers, Peter First, did some early work with huichols, became somewhat controversial in relation to the Carlos Castaneda controversy. Marlene de Rios, my dear friend of many years who passed away a few years ago, she really encouraged me to write on this topic, and I collaborated with her on a number of literary projects, as well as one of our ayahuasca studies of adolescent children of members of the UDV, a Brazilian syncretic ayahuasca church. And these kids were allowed, once they hit puberty, to participate in very controlled ceremonial sessions using ayahuasca. And we were asked by the UDV, who was under some pressure from the Brazilian judiciary, to go down and study the effects on these adolescents. So Marlene was part of that project. We got a number of publications, and we found very good health and safety profiles under the optimized conditions that ayahuasca was administered. And then Michael Harner, a fascinating anthropologist who passed away this past year. It's one of my favorite books, really fascinating look at a variety of different historical and prehistorical examples of hallucinogen use among indigenous people, as well as some accounts, historical examinations of the use of hallucinogens in Europe and how they became taboo and were harshly repressed by secular and religious authority during that time. And that repression was brought to the New World, particularly when the Spaniards hit South America and brutally expunged or attempted to expunge all use of these plants. Whoa. So we have a technical glitch. I know what's up next. Do we have a technical expert? Oh, there we go. Okay. So Richard Evans Schulte is another eminent anthropologist. Plants of the Gods, one of my favorite books, highly recommend. He wrote it with Albert Hoffman and later Christian Rach, the German kind of anthropologist or scholar added to it, but it gives very rich information there. So the world of anthropology has much to offer, and I highly recommend its thorough examination. As Matt mentioned, the sacramental use of hallucinogens dates back thousands of years. This is a drawing by Kathleen Harrison based on a cave painting in the Tassili Plain in southern Algeria, and you can see the shaman with these mushroom appendages, mushroom sprouts from appendages and torso, and you could see the mask in the shape of a beehive. And the significance of that is in the ancient world, there was no refrigeration. And to preserve plant products and fungi, they would use honey. So that would be the significance of that particular mask. But we know that there were religious and medicinal uses dating back thousands of years, and they were involved in rites of initiation, used by widely diverse cultures, and had a profound influence on the evolution of early religion, philosophy, and art. So the shamanic model, which my great friend Ralph Metzner really introduced me to. Oh, okay, that's good. So really dates back to prehistory, and these were the authorities on the use of psychoactive plants in ceremonial settings, and there's a great deal we could learn from them, starting with their use of fasting and other dietary restrictions, also sexual abstinence, which is reinforced particularly amongst, if you look at kind of extant indigenous use of ayahuasca. And with, I've had an opportunity to interview a number of individuals who had some difficulty during ayahuasca session, and I did feel there was a pattern of not following some of these purification practices that at least the ancient peoples and the indigenous people recommend. The importance of preparation, set and setting is critical to outcome, and establishing optimal safety parameters. The powerful expectation effects are extremely important. The importance of intention, ahead of time, really focusing in on what do you hope to get out of this experience, and it really needs to be this focus and really keen examination of purpose. One night I was at an ayahuasca ceremony, and going around the room, everyone would state their intention. And one of the individuals said, my intention is to experience the dark side. And I thought, uh-oh, this is going to be a long night. And it was, because stated intention often manifests itself. So when I work with patients getting ready for a psychedelic experience, examining the intention is of critical importance. And then formalized structure, very, very important. Then we have the induction of the altered state, navigating that altered state. And, there's some debate whether, for a facilitator, whether there needs to be whether they need their own personal experience. And my contention is it's very hard to help an individual navigate an altered state terrain if they've never gone through it themselves. So, so again, and integration as well, very important. Okay, so just some paintings of Pablo Amaringo, the ayahuasquero, Luis Eduardo Luna's book, Ayahuasca Visions, it gives really lovely examples of this artwork, which I've always appreciated. Just the degree to which indigenous use has been ritualized, and within that ritual context, there are safety facets built in, which I think are very important, and from which we have a great deal to learn. Looking at pubertal initiation, I treat a lot of kids, and I treat a lot of kids who take psychedelics, some to good effect, and some get into a lot of trouble. I think I found it of great interest to study the use of rituals that involve pubertal initiation for adolescents within indigenous cultures. And again, a lot that we can learn from these, how the indigenous people manage these states of consciousness. I've written about this at length with Marlene Dobkin de Rios, but just to review, hallucinogens facilitates hypersuggestible states. And it's critical then, the message that's being conveyed. When I was at an ayahuasca ceremony in Brazil, there was at the end of the UDV session, there was very active dialogue going back and forth between the maestri, the minister, the leader of the ceremony, and people in the congregation. My Portuguese wasn't so good. So I asked my interpreter, what were they saying? And she said, well, they're talking about how important it is that if you say you're going to be someplace at a certain time, you be there. And I thought, wow, this is extraordinary. I mean, this is South America, not necessarily known for being prompt and punctual. And yet these people I met in the UDV were extraordinarily successful. Some had started off at the bottom rungs of the socioeconomic ladder, and after their entry into the UDV and their twice monthly ayahuasca sessions over prolonged periods of time, they had become highly successful. So hypersuggestibility, opening yourself up. On the other hand, if you're in a very, psychopathic setting, like what a Manson family setting would have, and you're being told, very dark, destructive, crazy stuff, you might just take that to heart and act out those suggestions. So one must be exquisitely aware of the hypersuggestibility of individuals in these states. Also, the degree to which it strengthens, these experiences strengthen, they're elder facilitated, they're culturally sanctioned. When the pubertal initiation rites, which help facilitate positive outcomes, they strengthen social cohesion, and they provide, but also very important to look at the cultural context that you see in these traditional societies. And finally, and very, very importantly, the necessity to have integration, which you could see amongst indigenous people, and which in modern psychotherapy approaches needs also to be taken very seriously. So how much time do I have? Oh, okay. So again, just looking at some of these pubertal initiation rites. I think this is of the Bwiti cult in Gabon in West Africa, which uses the plant iboga as a psychoactive sacrament. Very high doses are used once or twice in an individual's lifestyle, including initiation. Low doses are used more frequently. This is considered very serious medicine. It's ancestor medicine. The goal of the experience is to have a vision of an ancestor, and in fact, to give you an idea of how serious it is, the initiates are basically instructed or basically administered iboga until one of two things happen: either they have a vision of an ancestor or they die. So this is very serious business. So. Again, the native use, they had some very interesting uses of these compounds that I think we could learn from. Just looking at just the epidemiology, just briefly, virtually no use of hallucinogens out in the world until the 60s. And then in the 60s, mid-60s, late 60s, boom, tremendous cultural explosion. Large numbers of individuals trying psychedelics under all sorts of conditions, some to positive effect, some to ill effect. However, no data was collected over this time, so we know a lot of people, particularly youth, believed to have taken LSD, but we don't have any data on this. In the mid-70s onwards, data started to be collected, for the most part of younger age populations, and whites, particularly from more affluent backgrounds, were more likely to experiment back then with psychedelics than lower socioeconomic people of color. These are consciousness expanding experiences. an affluent individual, their experience could kind of augment, amplify all the positive that's around in their lives, but someone very, very poor, amongst a kind of an oppressed minority living in difficult conditions may not necessarily want to have his or her consciousness expanded. So just as Matt was showing, just looking at kind of the relative relative risk, and you see hallucinogen rates fairly low compared to other compounds. A fair amount of effort has been gone into looking at degree of use among young people. Here you see the looking at youth, or 18 to 25, and then adults 26 and older. You see, kind of somewhat more use. I've always believed this data somewhat underestimates the true extent of prior use. Not everyone in these surveys attests honestly to their own personal use for a variety of reasons. And just to see kind of relative use of LSD. And there was a significant interest in salvia, about 5 years ago or so. It was legal. You could go to head shops on Hollywood Boulevard or Melrose Avenue in Los Angeles and buy it over the counter, potentized, and you could get 10x, 20x the degree to which would be potentized. But by 2014, interest started to fade. And here, I like this cartoon. So just looking at the fact that, no one is really paying attention to older people and their interest in psychedelics. Many individuals in their 60s, 70s, 80s were involved in, the 1960s and the cultural explosion that occurred then. Then they put their youth, because the atmosphere became darker and prohibitions amped up. Most individuals using psychedelics at that point put their interests aside and went on with their lives. And here they are now in their 60s and their 70s, even older, thinking to themselves, those were interesting experiences. They did have a strong impact on the course my life played out, and perhaps they might be of some interest and some value to me now. And I've been getting, as Alicia reflected this morning, I've been getting, since the Michael Pollan book came out, I've been getting a lot of communication from individuals of all ages, but I'm particularly interested in older individuals who are talking about where could they sign up. Now, Michael Pollan's book, an interesting book, #1 New York Times bestseller list, didn't get it all right, and I think he kind of painted an overly rosy picture of that there's more going on in terms of psychedelic research use than there is. I think there's a hope that things may expand, may grow, but that's not necessarily the case at this point. So unfortunately, I can't. I don't refer to the underground, and there are limited studies around, but I'm hearing more and more interest. Individuals approaching the end of life are reading studies we've done, that Matt and his group at Hopkins, Steve Ross and his group at NYU, working with advanced cancer patients and identifying the tremendous value. And this is all followed up on the early research of Stan Grof and others back in the 60s. There's just growing interest among individuals of all ages, and it has value to different stages in the life's developmental lifespan. So don't discount the elderly. They're very interested in this topic as well, both in terms of understanding their own life's path and looking to see the degree to which it might be valuable. Now, here's something we heard in the 60s. Alan Watts, the British theologian, a popular author, wrote about East and West philosophies, did say once you get the message, you can hang up the phone. And I think it resonated with many people in the 60s and 70s for whom there was no cultural context or no established context to work with these compounds. And yet, the phone can stay hung up for a while, but then it rings. And you could respond. Up to you. And up to circumstance, what's available. So potential adverse effects, I don't have a whole lot of time, but it's really important, especially who are health professionals, be aware, because we conduct this research, the research gets published, our name gets out there, and then we're contacted by people who take it in recreational context. And it's important to know that there can be a downside. Now, hallucinogens are non-addictive. Physiological withdrawal does not occur, but psychological dependence can occur. Also need to know there's rapid development of tolerance, and there can be cross-tolerance between different hallucinogens. The hallucinogen use disorder, basically, too much of a good thing is not necessarily a good thing. So people who use it too frequently, it can impair or vulnerable individuals who really should not be taking these compounds, can have impairment of judgment, impairment in their function, failure to control use, and so forth and so on. The bad trip. Usually, in almost all cases, these are transient events. Dave Nichols alerted me, or made the discovery a few years ago, that there may be a neurobiologic basis for the anxiety that occurs many hours into a psychedelic session, particularly an LSD session, that a metabolite, 13-hydroxy-LSD, is spun off, which is anxiogenic. And I thought that was a very interesting information that helps us maybe perhaps put this in also in a biological context. Now, set and setting are imperative. Sustained psychotic reactions are rare, but there are kind of predictors of who's going to have a sustained problem, those with severe underlying vulnerability. There should be ample screening of people, strong biological family histories of mental illness, excessive frequency of use, poor support systems, polydrug abuse, and a history of untreated PTSD. How to deal with these people is gentle reassurance, quiet setting, reorientation. Neuroleptics, I believe, are contraindicated unless someone is dangerously agitated or floridly psychotic in a sustained way. If you need to use a medication, benzos I think are far safer and more effective. Post-traumatic, basically, individuals can be traumatized. I've met with people with prior PTSD who took compounds under adverse circumstances and had an exacerbation of their PTSD. HPPD, I don't have really time to go into this, hallucinogenic persistent perception disorder, can be problematic in a small number of individuals, but important to know that this phenomena can occur. More likely when poor quality drug is taken and frequent administration. Skip that. The potential therapeutic implications, Matt alluded to the golden age of psychedelic research in the 50s and 60s. Over 1,000 papers published detailing the experiences of 40,000 patients. And many of these clinical conditions are refractory, non-responsive to conventional treatments, which really make this treatment model even of greater interest to us, because really we are tasked with healing, and conventional approaches often fall short, and this model may be able to help us advance beyond what conventional treatments have taken us. New research coming on, much of this kind of facilitated by funding and help from the Hefter Institute, other groups as well. But there have been, phase 1 studies started out in the early 90s, DMT, MDMA, ibogaine. We did the MDMA study, DMT in New Mexico, ibogaine in Miami. The work at Hopkins showing that you can reliably induce mystical states, psychospiritual epiphanies, which appear to be predictive of therapeutic outcome. You can see the various conditions that this treatment has been applied to. Some new work coming out of Brazil. I'm very pleased to see they're treating refractory depression, addiction, antisocial disorder, seemingly with positive effects, and the MDMA work. And it's very interesting, this hallucinogen treatment for medical indications, including cluster headaches with psilocybin, Parkinson's disease, harmine was a treatment for Parkinson's in the 20s and 30s before Park Davis invented L-DOPA. So that's worth exploring again. And then Dave Nichols' son, Chuck Nichols at LSU, is doing some fascinating work, some of the most fascinating work I've seen in the last several years, looking at the potential of potent hallucinogens treating autoimmune disorders. He's got an allergic mouse model. He's treating with DOI, an extremely potent hallucinogen, and he's finding an amelioration of the asthma. It abolishes the asthmatic response. So rich in potential, not just psychiatrically, but medically as well. Our study, working with advanced cancer patients, published in the Archives of General Psychiatry, now renamed JAMA Psychiatry. We did the first study in several decades after the Grob studies were closed down, and we found sustained drop in depression scores over 6 months, similar to Matt's. We had a smaller dose, a lower dose as per the FDA, because no one had worked with this dose in some 30 years or so, this drug in 30 years, so they wanted us to use a more modest dose. We established good safety parameters, allowing the NYU and the Hopkins group to get approval for higher dose treatments. We also found sustained improvement of anxiety. This is the NYU study, which used a higher dose and even got stronger positive effects. Some of their data. Same thing with the Johns Hopkins group, did an excellent study, just taking this work several notches higher. So my last slide, you'll be happy to know. So what's ahead? Challenges for the future. The regulatory agencies, whereas very difficult and challenging to work with early on, have become a positive experience. They've been very helpful. They help us optimize our protocols, and they've allowed quite a number of new studies to be approved and to be conducted. There is a lot more funding available. There's some controversy as to where this, how this funding is being utilized, but it's important to know that this increased funding base will allow the implementation of new projects moving into the future. The phase 3 trials also, some with refractory depression, a group in Europe, a group in the US, are both kind of working on parallel lines, developing a treatment for refractory depression. We'll see how that pans out, but there is likely going to be a significant uptick in the number of people being treated within sanctioned research settings. The ketamine model, I think I made some comments on that before. New novel psychoactive substances, well, that's maybe a topic for another talk. And microdosing, very interesting concept, been popularized by Jim Fadiman over the last few years. I'm often asked about microdosing, and my answer is, I don't know. I don't know, even though there are some very positive anecdotal reports I'm hearing about, there have been no rigorous, controlled, placebo-controlled double-blind studies, which you really need to know whether or not there is any efficacy to the microdose model. So basically, that's my talk. They'll say goodbye now. I think it's important to acknowledge the wisdom of the elders, the wisdom of the indigenous people. We've got a lot to learn from them. This is an exciting time in our history as we move into the future with this model up again, and I think to a far greater degree being accepted by mainstream medicine and psychiatry and the mainstream culture. And I think as long as we use good judgment and optimize safety and don't get too far ahead of ourselves, I think the future looks very bright indeed. So thank you very much. I appreciate this opportunity to be here.
Thank you very much.